That is us at 10:02, so we will kick off there. So, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Halloween threat briefing. The spookiness is unfortunately kept to a minimum, as this is obviously fairly serious stuff we're talking about. So, these sessions, we typically hold them last Thursday of the month. The Adarma Threat Intelligence team aim to uncover the latest emerging trends, tactics, and techniques employed by adversaries seeking to exploit vulnerabilities in our digital ecosystems. From ransomware attacks crippling businesses to espionage campaigns targeting sensitive data, we uncover the multifaceted nature of cyber threats and equip you with actionable insights to help better defend your organisation. My name is Jerry Brown. I'm one of the threat specialists here at Adarma. I'm joined today by fellow threat specialist David Wasnop and Cian Heasley, the threat team lead. This month's briefing is going to look over the past 6 months at what has been happening across the world of critical national infrastructure. There will be an opportunity for questions at the end, so please feel free to fire any questions in the chat as we're going through, and we'll pick them up at the end. To start off, what I'm going to do is just give us a quick kind of talk through of who we are here at Adarma. So we are the leading UK-based independent security operations specialist, delivering an integrated suite of advisory, engineering and managed services to large and complex organisations. You can see here just some of the customers we work with, spread across industries from retail, manufacturing, financial services, and critical national infrastructure. And here you can get an insight into some of the portfolio of the work that we do here. So everything from managed SOC and threat intelligence services through to maturity assessments and crisis simulation. And with that, then, we're going to jump into the actual briefing itself and have a quick look at the agenda. So Cian is going to kick things off with a bit of an introduction into some of the emerging threats, before then taking us through the healthcare section. David will then come in to cover off energy and utilities. Defence will be handled by myself. Then Cian will finish us off with a look through the transport industry, at which point then we can all jump in and take any questions that you might have. So with that, I'll now pass over to Cian to kick things off. Whenever you're ready, Cian.
Good morning, everyone. So I want to talk a little bit about what kind of threats we're going to be looking at in terms of critical national infrastructure, and also sort of some of the industries that we're going to be focusing on, not just within this talk, but also obviously the diverse industries that make up critical national infrastructure. And also we want to highlight throughout this that I think there's an increasing willingness of threat actors now, whether they're APTs or ransomware groups or hacktivists, to actually get in and disrupt CNI in a way that they might not have before. So ransomware groups after, for instance, the Colonial Pipeline attack, DarkSide was pretty much destroyed as a group after that because of sanctions and international law enforcement cooperation against them. But we now see ransomware groups in particular having a much greater willingness to target hospitals or power plants or related CNI that they might have been more wary about targeting before. And similarly with hacktivists, and I think David's going to talk a little bit about that in terms of the energy sector, and also I'm going to talk about that a little bit, especially in terms of the transport industry, which is a favorite target of hacktivists right now. So the different high-level threats that we're going to be looking at are nation states. So the obvious example here would be APT attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure, which have been a regular occurrence both before the invasion by Russia and since. Recently, we've also seen this year attacks on residential heating systems that were set up to spread residential heating throughout various say tower blocks or areas of a city in Ukraine. And those have been attacked with malware that were designed to basically switch those off and disable them, leaving the people obviously without heating. Cyber criminals stealing data. So this is might not necessarily be a ransomware attack insofar as there's double extortion, but they're stealing that data, they're trying to monetize that data, or they're trying to hold that data to ransom. And then classic double extortion ransomware. So every industry is a target for this, but for CNI, obviously this could cause massive issues, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. In the next section, we'll talk about effects that it's had on healthcare. And then finally, we have hacktivist attacks, and these are hackers that are driven by political and ideological motivations. And they are particularly interested in a few industries. Defense could be added in here, but energy and transportation are the two that spring to mind for me. So next slide, please. So we're going to open up with healthcare here. And just really quickly at a glance, so ransomware attacks are the primary issue that healthcare faces right now. Over the past few quarters, we've seen several major ransomware incidents. I'm going to discuss a few of them in the last 2 quarters. Notable attacks include those on Change Healthcare in February of 2004. Up here in Scotland, we had the NHS Dumfries and Galloway ransomware attack in March 2024, and then the resulting data leakage from that, which affected a lot of patients in the NHS up here in Scotland. And then there was Synovus down in London, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail. And then OneBlood, which was a similar situation where a company that handled blood testing in the US, in this case, was hit with a ransomware attack. And then obviously that affected patient care and hospital appointments, everything related to that. And then in addition to ransomware, we've also got data breaches, which sometimes go hand in hand with ransomware if it's double extortion. And then nation state and APT groups, which have also branched out into their own ransomware attacks now, which I think we may discuss a little bit as we go on. Next slide, please. So this is a big timeline. We're not going to go through all of it, but this is a way of demonstrating just what exactly we're up against in terms of the healthcare industry and the attacks that have taken place in the last 6 months or so. The ones that I wanted to focus in on here was Ascension Healthcare on the 8th of May, and that was Black Basta. That affected, I think, maybe 100 different hospitals in the end, because this is basically an association of hospitals in the US that are under an umbrella group. And so essentially the effect of Ascension being ransomware then affected all of the hospitals that were connected to it in some way, and the coordination between those hospitals. I also want to talk a little bit about Synovus, but we'll go on to that actually after this. And on the 26th of June, KBC Zagreb Hospital, which is, I think, two of the main hospitals in Croatia, were ransomed. That was a huge impact there in Croatia. And finally, I wanted to talk about OneBlood, which, as I said, similar to Synovus, resulted in a lot of delayed hospital visits, issues with getting people blood transfusions, issues with getting blood donations, all of those associated things which can impact patient care, can impact people getting the surgery that they need on time, the treatment they need on time. And then if that data is leaked, obviously that's extremely sensitive data relating to blood testing. So those are a few of the incidents in the last 6 months that I think are particularly telling as to the issues facing healthcare as an industry. Next slide, please. So we looked in the Adarma Threat Intel platform at basically all of the data that we've added relating to healthcare and all of the reports and all of the incidents and everything else. And we're able to pull out the top 5. And then of those top 5, then we've got the percentages here as to what were the most tagged, what were the most seen in the Threat Intel platform. So starting at the darkest green there, which is the most prevalent, we've got data staged. So this is data staged for theft. So a ransomware group will collect all of the data that they want to exfiltrate, and put that in one place. They'll probably compress it, zip it up, and then they'll find some way to get that off the network to a place that they can then review it and eventually either sell it or release it if no ransom is paid. The next darkest shade of green there is data staged local staging. So that's essentially just a sub-technique of data staged. So you're staging local data as opposed to maybe it could be in the cloud or whatever else. Then we've got network share discovery. So once again, we can see that the trend here is towards either acquiring the data or staging the data for theft. And then the last two are masquerading. So masquerading is at a high level is essentially disguising malicious software or malware as legitimate software or tasks or services, as we see down in the bottom. So you might name your ransomware executable the same as a common Windows executable. You might label your task or service as the same as a common Windows system task or service, in the hopes that that will disguise your intentions. So those are the 5 top techniques that we've seen in our Threat Intel platform. Next slide, please. So I said I'd talk a little bit more about the Synovus breach. This was affected, I think, 5 different hospitals down in England. So I wanted to go a little bit through the timeline to show the length of the impact that this had on the affected, not just Synovus itself, but also patients and hospitals. So on June 3rd, the breach occurred. June 4th, the NHS UK declared a critical incident as a result of that breach. June 4th, Synovus released their first press release to say, we've had a breach. June 10th, the NHS issued calls for blood donors to replenish stocks because Synovus was handling all of the data around blood transfusions, blood donations, blood tests, everything. So they were an outsourced third party that were essentially handling all of that for the NHS trust that they were involved in. And then on June 17th, Synovus press update, and they started talking about data loss. So this is 14 days after the initial breach. They're then able to say, okay, you know, we've gone through our investigation. We think there's some data stolen. And then 3 days later, Cian, who are the group that were responsible for the breach, published 400 gigabytes of stolen data. And I'll talk a little bit about the impact after this, but medical data, of course, is extremely sensitive, and it's a huge impact for anybody that's related to any of the data in those leaks. And then September 13th, so this is, you know, a long time after the initial breach, Synovus announced that most processes are restored. So there was still, I think, some manual processes that were having to go through on pen and paper, but for the most part, normal service was restored. But we're looking there, obviously, at, you know, a few months. So it really shows, I think, the timeline that you're looking at, especially in healthcare when there's an impact such as this. And then if we could have the next slide, please. So the ransomware executable detonated successfully on Synovus systems, locked all infected systems. Patient data that was leaked include names, dates of birth, NHS numbers, and blood test results. The business data that was leaked include details of financial transactions and business account spreadsheets. So that was internal Synovus financial data. As of, I think this was late August, there was 9,423 outpatient appointments that were postponed, 1,660 elective procedures postponed, and Synovus themselves had to rebuild 60 of their core laboratory IT systems, either from scratch or from backups. So a massive impact there, not just for the patients themselves, but obviously the company and the hospitals that were associated with Synovus. Actually.
Thanks, Cian. So moving on to energy and utility sectors now. And the main threats that these sectors face at the moment are from ransomware attacks and hacktivists. We've seen attacks on internet-connected OT devices at the back end of last year and through into the middle of this year, and multiple advisories from government bodies like CISA and the NCSC, as well as manufacturers of those technologies, urging customers and companies to secure those systems and make sure that they don't place industrial control systems on the internet and make sure they're behind the appropriate controls. We've kind of get to see a major third-party supplier breach affect the sector this year, but that is also always a threat, as it is to most companies. But any energy and utility companies that are susceptible to network and device infiltration campaigns, we've seen the likes of China engage in these this year and previous years as well. Next slide, please. So here's some notable events from this year, some incidents, and you can see that ransomware and hacktivism, like I said, feature heavily, and we've seen a number of high-profile law enforcement disruptions to ransomware groups this year with Lockbit and the likes. But we've also started to see it happen a little bit with the hacktivist groups that have engaged in attacks against CNI. We've had treasury sanctions from the US against members of the cyber army of Russia Reborn. We saw arrests actually in Spain back in July of members of No Name 057, and these are groups that engaged in those attacks on those internet connected OT devices that I previously mentioned. The same for Anonymous Sudan at the end there that we saw action against this month. They all engaged in that activity. So that the focus is shifting towards them as well. And if we can have the next slide, please. Thanks. So I just wanted to look in a little bit more detail into the American water breach, because it's just happened this month. They disclosed to the SEC that they had suffered unauthorized access to their systems. And American Water is the biggest company in America for water. And it's really telling the difference in responses and impact to these attacks that different water companies in particular experience, largely due in the US due to the relatively unregulated nature of that sector. You have a lot of small outfits supplying water to local communities, and they don't have the money of the bigger groups. So you tend to see when the smaller groups get attacked, it's generally much more impactful. Sometimes we see actual physical controls being changed, and there was the Arkansas City ransomware attack that they suffered last month in September, and they had to revert to manual controls. So it shows the lack of investment there in cybersecurity, as well as the luck sometimes that the attackers have in getting access to these systems. We currently don't know who breached American Water, and that hasn't been either disclosed or discovered yet. And there was no indication that any OT systems were affected. So it does seem like similar to what we saw at the start of this year with Southern Water in the UK, a ransomware attack just affecting the IT systems, customer billing services going down, things like that. So it's likely that that's what the nature of the American Water breach is, but nevertheless, it does highlight the vulnerability of these systems, much like all. Next slide, please. So Cian's mentioned earlier, hacktivists, and I've mentioned they play a big role in threats to the energy and utility sectors. Now, it can be easy to kind of dismiss hacktivists a little bit because of their bravado and overinflated claims about the things they get up to. We see footage of haphazard interactions with OT systems that they're not unfamiliar with, that they may have landed on by accident. And it's easy to look at that and think they don't pose a threat, and that they're not skillful or good enough to defeat your expensive security controls that you spent a lot of time setting up around your OT and ICS systems. But I think that would be a mistake. We know that groups like the Cyber Army of Russia Reborn have members of Russian state APTs within their ranks. The DDoS campaigns that these groups typically engage in. There was a big one that they're called DDoSia that basically paid people to take part in it, and there's some anecdotal evidence at least that funds for those payments came from Russian state. So when you take that into account, alongside the experience that Russian APTs have and are getting attacking the Ukrainian energy infrastructure, we've seen a lot of damaging malware attacks, wiper malware attacks against that infrastructure. And I think if those APT groups shared that knowledge with the likes of the hunter killers, that's one hacktivist group that specifically targets SCADA and OT systems. I think it could be very dangerous, and I also think that the term hacktivist sometimes conjures up notions of, noble motivations, but I think the lines are blurring there as well. As I mentioned about the payments for the engaging in the DDoS campaigns, there's also evidence now that groups, specifically the hunter killer group, are planning on engaging in ransomware activities in the future. Whether or not that's purely going to be financial, or whether they will use ransomware as a way of trying to get companies to take some sort of action on their behalf that might benefit their cause. Who knows? But it's certainly something that we'll keep an eye on, and as I say, certainly not to be dismissed. Next slide, please. So, as Cian mentioned, with the healthcare industry, we've got our top 5 techniques for the energy and utility sector here as well. You can see that really, with the exception of brute force, all these techniques appeared in our Q2 statistics as well. And they're all associated with the initial access phase of an attack. So you've got the likes of your brute force and your valid account TTPs there, which, highlights really the importance of getting your MFA basic protections like MFA in place, and monitoring for things like MFA fatigue attacks, and also ensuring that any potentially leaked credentials are changed and locked down. But also with the impairing of defenses and modifying tools when attackers get on systems, one of the things they try and do is turn off antivirus and local firewall settings and things like that. So monitoring for that kind of behavior, and for any commands linked to network discovery. All those techniques are kind of aimed at facilitating lateral movement, as well as privilege escalation. So monitoring of those indicators is also critical, as well as I say, ensuring that the access and authentication is tightened up with your MFA. And that's me. So I'll pass you on to Jerry now, who's going to talk about defense.
Thank you very much. So back to myself. So defense is a sector which continually sees itself being targeted by state-sponsored threat actors. That is especially against that current backdrop of conflict in Ukraine and Israel. The possession of advanced weapon technology, combined with regular direct technical links into defense departments and defense ministries, mean that is almost certainly not going to change. These nation-state threat actors are working in support of national-level operational or strategic objectives, so thus obtaining intellectual property and intelligence are vital objectives for these groups. Defence, like everything else, is also a regular target of hacktivist groups, both in the government defence ministries and defence contractors. These groups, particularly the pro-Russian side of things, are very geopolitically astute. They respond rapidly to any major changes in kind of policy or politics, but also what weapons are being supplied. One of the real key areas to look out for at the moment is Ukraine's request for authorization to conduct long-range strikes inside Russian borders. If that is authorized, I would expect a very rapid response from these hacktivist groups, particularly against suppliers of those particular weapons, which we have seen in the past. Important to note that these groups are still overwhelmingly limited to DDoS attacks, kind of lacking the skills in a lot of cases for more sophisticated kind of hack and leak operations. And with a defence contractor, DDoSing of a public website is less likely to have an operational impact than if you were, say, a retail company, for example. But as has been kind of pointed out, there is definitely still advancements being made by some of these groups into more sophisticated attacks. Other real key observation that we've seen this quarter was a significant surge in defence data being advertised for sale. Places like XSS, breach forums, Russian marketplace, etc. We've seen things like PII, email addresses, source codes, as well as domain admin credentials, VPN, and SSH accesses into companies as well. So I've not kind of specifically mentioned it yet, but ransomware clearly is still a threat to defence organisations, as it is to everyone. Ransomware groups typically still targeting opportunistically for financial gain, so there's nothing to suggest that these groups are specifically focused on the defence sector. On the chart here, you can see the ransomware along the top and hacktivist activity at the bottom. Of the attacks we've seen in the last 6 months, only one relates to a UK company, and that is Chemring, who appeared on Medusa's leak site back in May. Group claimed to have stolen 186 gigabytes of data, includes confidential documents, databases, and design files, with a ransom demand of $3.5 million. So still kind of fairly substantial numbers being thrown around. Hacktivist side of things I've touched on already, but you can see here are spreads of both the pro-Russian and the pro-Palestinian groups being active against the sector. A couple of interesting points that I want to highlight from this timeline. First off, pretty much bang in the middle, we've got no name 05716, the ever-present constant in the Hacktivist game. And among a few attacks, we've seen them spin up Operation Fuck NATO, where they pull together a collection of other like-minded hacktivist groups to operate together. And while this did see a number of attacks by these groups, it hasn't really yet materialised into anything more significant than we would see these groups doing independently. Next, I want to jump over to the far right-hand side of the timeline there, and that mal spam campaign. This is the relatively recent news that ESET had their Israeli partner compromised and used to operate this mal spam campaign. There's not been any explicit confirmation of who conducted the attack or the scope of the targets, but I would be shocked if the Israeli defence was not somewhere in that list. And then final thing that I want to touch on from this timeline is Handala back in May. So they first cropped up on the scene late last year and are a pro-Palestinian and pro-Hamas group. Initially, we're operating very much in the hacktivist space, and we've seen a very few kind of bold claims, such as hacking the Israeli Iron Dome radar system, a lot of other high-profile hacking leaks. But the data never materialised in a lot of those cases to back it up. What we've actually seen now since the summer is them starting to pivot more towards ransomware operations, so suggesting a potential change in sophistication from the group. There's a belief that it is an Iranian-based group, and we know a lot of the Iranian nation-state actors do some kind of moonlighting within the ransomware space, so not entirely outside of the realms of possibility. Moving now very much into that state-sponsored activity, I'm not going to cover everything that's happened over the last 6 months. That would take up pretty much the rest of the time we have. So instead, I'm just going to highlight a few of the key interesting reports from across the big four. Starting off then with Russia, and there is a joint cybersecurity advisory released by the FBI, CISA and NSA along with other international partners. And this report was covering the activity of the Russian GRU 161st Specialist Training Centre and Unit 29155. You may also know them as Cadet Blizzard or Ember Bear. So Unit 29155 is believed to consist of junior active duty GRU officers operating under the direction of a more experienced leadership, appearing to gain cyber experience and enhancing their technical skills through conducting cyber operations and intrusions. Notably, it's also believed that this group rely on non-GRU actors, including known cyber criminals and enablers, in order to conduct these operations. And despite their junior in-training nature, the group has still been responsible for attempted coups, sabotage, influence operations and assassination attempts through Europe since at least 2020. Despite being part of the GRU, it's worth noting that the unit operate completely independently from the more well-known groups such as Fancy Bear and Sandworm. Also with Russia, I want to touch on the very hot off-the-press Mystic report into the Midnight Blizzard spearphishing campaign. This report only came out a couple of days ago, 29th of October, and details a highly targeted campaign targeting over 100 organisations across defence, government, academia and NGOs. The lure that they're using typically is relating to Microsoft, Amazon Web Services and the concept of zero trust, and include notably a remote desktop protocol configuration file, which if ran then connects through to an actor-controlled system, giving them the ability to move in, do discovery, lateral movement and all of the usual things. Moving across now to China, and the most kind of relevant incident here is clearly the compromise of the UK MOD payroll system. This was a system that was supplied by an external contractor, Services Connected Limited, and notably did not contain any operational MOD data. This is a fairly typical strategy we see by these nation-state groups, targeting those third-party suppliers with access into defence ministries rather than going straight to the end target, hitting that soft exposed underbelly instead. There's been no technical data revealed around the breach, as suspected to be the work of a Chinese threat actor. Chinese cyber actors typically operate as either part of the Ministry of State Security, the MSS, or the People's Liberation Army, the PLA. PLA typically very tight regional focus on the immediate areas surrounding China, while the MSS is tasked instead with conducting international espionage campaigns. As such, highly likely we're looking at an MSS threat actor carrying out this attack. Moving down to Iran, once again a joint cybersecurity advisory from the FBI, CSAT and DC3, detailing the activities of an Iran-based threat actor who continue to target the defence sector in the US and other countries. The group in question is Pioneer Kitten. You may also know them as Fox Kitten, Lemon Sandstorm or Parasite. have been active since at least 2017 and as recently as August 2024. So this group is identified as having two very separate activity streams. The first consists of activity in support of the government of Iran, and typically this is involving targeting defence networks in the US, Israel, Azerbaijan, and the United Arab Emirates to conduct theft of sensitive information. The second stream involves a high volume of network intrusion attempts against organisations, including financial institutes, healthcare, and schools. They are then attempting to monetize these accesses, either through sale on dark web marketplaces or through collaborating directly with ransomware affiliates. And they've been observed collaborating with Alfie or Black Cat, Ransom House, and No Escape. And it is likely that this ransomware activity is not sanctioned by the Iranian government and is being conducted purely for personal financial gain for the operators. Finishing things off now on North Korea, and again, a mystic report into Moonstone Sleet. Now, quite often we see a lot of North Korean groups having overlaps in TTPs, so misattribution is quite common. So Mystic kind of identifying another distinct group is definitely noteworthy. They do employ similar North Korean TTPs, things like setting up fake companies and fake job opportunities in order to target individuals, but we've also observed them creating malicious versions of legitimate tools, even going as far to create fully functioning games which can deploy custom malware once launched. Group has been observed conducting attacks for both financial and espionage purposes, again, not unique among North Korean groups. And in one instance, they compromised a defence company in December of 2023, stealing credentials and intellectual property before eventually deploying ransomware in April of 2024, presumably once they deemed there was no longer any intelligence value to gain from that access. Once again, here I want to finish off with some attack statistics from across Q3. Again, this is from our threat intelligence platform rather than kind of direct SOC data. So this is generally things that are coming later in the attack chain. The first two TTPs, Cian's already covered in his section with data staging. So this is them pulling all of the data they want to steal before eventually doing one single exfiltration. Next up, non-application layer protocol. So this is when actors are utilizing lower layers of the OSI model to communicate with their C2 servers. ICMP is a particular example of this, as it's not commonly monitored due to being part of the IP suite. Network shared discovery and indicator removal are pretty much what the name says. Discovering shared folders and drives to help identify potential systems of interest for lateral movement, and attempting to cover their tracks by deleting or modifying artifacts generated by their actions. That's everything from me then. I'll pass on to Cian to take us down the home straight with the transport sector.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Next slide, please. So transportation sector is a favorite target for cyber criminals and hacktivists. It is good for cyber criminals because you can steal payment data, you can steal P2 data. It's good for hacktivists because if people can't book their plane flight, or they can't get their bus tickets or their tram tickets, or however you might travel on public transport or other transport networks, it's good for them to be able to disrupt that, because it's very clear to normal everyday people who might not notice if a government website is taken down or a defense sector website is taken down, something similar. You will notice if you suddenly can't get home because you can't buy a ticket. So it's great for them to expend some energy doing a DDoS that will at least garner local headlines in wherever they've decided to attack. Ransomware attacks are also the main attack vector. So then we get into our denial of service and then data breaches. And I wanted to talk about, I think, 5 of the main groups that are targeting in Q3. So that was Akira, Ransom Hub, Ricida, Helldown, and Kill Security. And I think we'll talk about a few of those maybe as we go. So next slide, please. So I cut out some of the smaller attacks. I cut out some of the ones that were related to logistical operations that were very specific to certain countries. So I wanted to focus a little bit on public transport because we are talking about hacktivist attacks that were to garner headlines. So I wanted to discuss 2 or 3 things in particular. There was the Irish Transport DDoS, which was an interesting one. It affected a lot of Irish government websites, but also Irish public transport infrastructure, and that was around the European elections, and that was believed to be Russia-backed groups that were attempting to cause disruption around that time. The other ones I wanted to talk about was EcoMobil on the 30th of August, and that was by a group that appears to be Turkish. They are Islamist or pro-Palestinian group called Kund El Aqsa, and for a hacktivist group, they were actually able to not just knock anything offline, do a DDoS. They were actually able to get into the back end of the app that was used to book bus tickets within a certain region of Turkey, and essentially disable that, and also display messages on buses that were connected to that network, which warned of a suicide bombing attack on the bus. So all buses were shut down. Passengers obviously were made to leave buses. People couldn't use the app. So it was quite a big impact and made headlines in Turkey. The other I wanted to talk about was the TCC group in Hong Kong. So this is another group that does international shipping, and they had some severe repercussions from an attack by Lockbit that caused disruption to their shipping. And I'm going to go into the TfL breach in London and the Seattle port attack in a little bit more detail. Next slide, please. So the Seattle port breach is an interesting one because the same company operates also the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. Both were affected, but we're not really talking about aviation in this discussion. And the fact that the aviation impacts were talked about so much more made me curious about how the port itself was impacted. So on August 24th, the Port of Seattle reported an ongoing security incident that was subsequently attributed to ransomware. And the attack impacted the port and airport operations. So Wi-Fi, email, websites associated with both the port and the airport were taken down, and luggage and logistics functions were impacted. Luggage obviously at the airport, but logistics at the port. So there was some problems getting boats and ships in to the port, making sure that all of the proper paperwork is done, due diligence, import licensing, all of that stuff was impacted. And port staff actually wound up having to conduct physical inspections with clipboards. So they were going around the port itself, which, as you can see on the right, is a very large area, complex infrastructure, to make sure that they could actually keep business continuity going there. So that was checking, I guess, licensing for boats, whether they were in the right harbor. All of that stuff had to be done with a clipboard and pen. Reseda wound up leaking a lot of files from both the airport and the port after refusal to pay Bitcoin ransom. And I think they're still looking at the impact of those leaked files and impact to the potential to the port and the airport. Next slide, please. Closer to home, down in London, we have the TfL breach. So TfL, for those who don't know, is the local government body that's responsible for most of London's transport network. So that's trains, underground, buses, you name it, basically everything within the bounds of London. September 2nd, TfL disclosed an ongoing security breach. And then September 20th, around 5,000 customers received a notification of sensitive P2, including financial data breach. And I believe this was from a system that was compromised that was used to give refunds to people who had, I guess, needed a refund for their, I think it was London Underground travel. So that system specifically, they believe, was breached and data was stolen from it. And on the right, we have a photo here of a line of people who work for TfL having to line up to verify their IDs to unlock their user accounts. So the attack was taken so seriously by TfL, and I have to admire them for this, that they essentially made all of their staff come in person to verify their identity in case mitigation had failed in any way to catch compromised accounts or anything else. This attack has been linked to Scattered Spider. Scattered Spider is a bit of a nebulous threat actor group insofar as it seems to be made up of a lot of different subgroupings and people who are maybe socially connected or connected by business, but aren't a group maybe in the way that we would think of other groups. And there's been one arrest, and that was of a 17-year-old down in England who was arrested as a result of this. There's no real details as to that, but we can assume, I think, safely that he was either a member of Scattered Spider or the associated group, the COM, which is sort of a Venn diagram of younger threat actors who are involved in cybercrime in Europe and some in America as well. I think that's it. Next slide, please. Oh no, I'm forgetting the attack stats. Sorry, everyone. So we've discussed data stage and data stage for theft there, local data staging. Indicator removal, as Jerry said, is fairly self-explanatory. You're threat actors trying to remove traces that they've left on the system that might help with either detection or mitigation or a subsequent investigation. Similarly, we've discussed non-application layer protocol, and network shared discovery, again, is related to data theft. So we can see that these all skew towards, I would say, ransomware attacks on the transportation sector. Next slide, please. Now we're done. I jumped the gun there a little bit. So if there's any questions for any three of us, and it doesn't have to be just on the sectors that we've covered, Elder CNI or any of the groups that we've talked about or anything else, we will endeavour to answer them.
I'll jump in with a kind of question for both of you while we wait for some things to appear in the chat. It seems to me that hacktivist activity wasn't really a thing that we talked about too much until the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That seems to me to have just kick-started hacktivism as a thing. Obviously, we had Anonymous doing their things for years, going against their kind of particular crusades, but it seems definitely that it's been the last few years. What do you see happening going forward? Is it going to continue to be a thing? Is it going to die off potentially as those conflicts in Israel and in Ukraine kind of stagnate or come to some kind of conclusion? What do you see as the inevitable kind of outcome of this?
I like your optimism that these conflicts will come to a conclusion. I'm hopeful for that. So for my part, I think professionalization is what we're going to see. So a lot of the Russian groups, and I'm on Telegram and some of their channels and their chats, are simultaneously running their hacktivist ideological attacks and campaigns, but they're also advertising underground forums, or advertising DDoS booter services, they're advertising stolen credentials that maybe aren't linked to countries that they're trying to attack ideologically. So they've done other hacks as well, and they're trying to monetize that. And then obviously we see people moving into ransomware more, as David mentioned. We've seen pro-Ukrainian groups use ransomware against Russian companies, but deliberately not giving any option for decryption. So basically using stolen lockbit executables and then just encrypting and then offering no option for you to decrypt. But I think we'll start to see groups, maybe not pro-Ukrainian, but other groups offering decryption as an option. Maybe if these are companies that aren't necessarily related to NATO countries, if in the case of Russia, or aren't related to any of the industries that they think are worthy of attacking, it might be that they're just collateral damage, and in that case they can make a few Bitcoin off of the whole situation.
Yeah, I agree with what Cian said there. I think we will see these hacktivist groups moving more towards the criminal, financially motivated side of cyber criminal that we see. The ideological side of things will become less until the next big thing comes along that I think allows them to hide some of their activity behind and pretend that they're doing it for nationalistic or any kind of loyalty. I think once they get a taste for ransom money, if indeed these groups do start to branch out into that area, I think they'll find that side of things much more lucrative. As Cian said, I think we'll still see them engaging in their DDoS campaigns because it's a great way of disrupting certainly smaller companies and things, and great way of getting the names in the news. But certainly we've already seen, you mentioned the original kind of Anonymous. They had a kind of air of I wouldn't say nobility, but some of the actions they undertook when they first came to the fore kind of had semi justified, in their eyes at least, motivations, and I think that side of things is getting less and less, and they're aligning themselves with military campaigns that we've seen. Obviously all this hacktivist activity has really blown up in the past couple of years, with the Ukraine and now again in the last year or so from events in the Middle East. But yeah, I don't think they tend to go back from these things. They don't retreat from the brink once they've started down certain paths. So yeah, I certainly see the OT side of things. I don't see that getting any less dangerous from a hacktivist point of view. And I think any kind of guardrails that might be in place around APT groups or anything like that, I don't think they exist. Not in the same way, at least, with these hacktivist groups. So we might see much more of a Wild West kind of targeting without regard for the consequences, because they don't represent a country. So it's much more difficult for victim countries to impose sanctions or to take retaliatory action against them, other than what we've seen with the sanctions and arrests where they can. But in that respect, I think hacktivists are a great way of nation states kind of subcontracting attacks out to groups that are a lot less risky for them. Certainly, as I say, in terms of the comeback from the countries of the companies and organizations that they attack.
And we've seen that with and you were talking about utilities, David, with water companies. I mean, these are people pressing buttons on what is it, human machine interfaces online, or your OT interfaces that could poison people, that could really harm people if there weren't, if people didn't notice that chemicals have been added or maybe hadn't been added, or whatever else. So yeah, I really do think that we're in a dangerous time for groups that maybe aren't nation state backed, but the nation state where they are, and enable them or allow them. They're not interested in stopping them, and just acting out in a way that maybe they don't even understand the danger of what they're doing. So yeah,
absolutely. I mean, there are a lot of controls in place in the processes, especially when it comes to chemical dosing of water systems. But it only takes one attack on a small company that has fewer controls and fewer monitoring in place, and you could be left with a situation of several lives lost as a result, which is absolutely not where you want to be.
I think there's actually an interesting kind of joining point between parts that you both raised, with the kind of accountability and kind of punishments and the professionalization of it. Because we've seen a lot of the groups initially were not the best at OPSEC. It was relatively inexperienced people, so they were, names were getting leaked online, information was getting leaked online. But I think as we see them go down the professionalization side of things, learning from the kind of their older brothers in the ransomware gig, they're going to have that kind of OPSEC and PERSEC dialed down a lot more. So being able to discover who they are to bring any kind of repercussions against them legally or kind of criminally is going to become much more difficult as well, assuming they are outside of somewhere like Russia, which will still generally put its arms around those people, assuming they're pointing their attacks in a westernly direction. So it's just, it'll be interesting to see what develops in that space.
We've not had any kind of... Oh, sorry, Joe.
No, on you go.
I was going to say really quick, I was fascinated by the anonymous Sudan. So we read over as a team, actually, we read over the charging documents that the FBI released and the US DOJ. And they were using infrastructure that was, I think, cloud infrastructure, either AWS or Azure or something similar. So once the FBI were able to work out where that infrastructure was, they were able to then get a court order in place and get the details. And these guys were accessing that infrastructure from mobile hotspots that were their own personal cell phones. So I think in their case, if they were in Sudan, maybe they thought that the US government wouldn't be able to come to Sudan and get them. I don't know what their reasoning was, but the groups that are in countries like Iran or Russia don't need to have good OPSEC necessarily. They might want to for their own reasons. They don't want other people in Russia or Iran to know they have a bunch of money, maybe, or they have enemies for whatever reason. But we still see some pretty shocking slip-ups, like Anonymous Sudan, just seeming to believe that so long as they spread their infrastructure out, they were selling access to their back end for DDoS, and the FBI, I think, just basically got an informant to pay for some, and then was able to find the IP address with the control panel for the whole thing. And from there, they were able to work out who these guys were in pretty short order. So yeah, I think that'll be a lesson for other people in similar groups. Each time this happens, I would imagine they'll pay attention, but we're still seeing some of them being incredibly sloppy, in my opinion. Anyway, sorry, Jerry, back to you.
No, I was going to kind of bring us to the end, but that's probably a brilliant point to end on. We've not had any kind of particular questions come in, so clearly we have stunned everyone to silence and answered all of the questions preemptively. So that is us for the day then. Thank you very much, everyone, for your time, your attendance. Hopefully you got something interesting out of it. And all I can say now is enjoy the rest of your day, enjoy your Halloween when it comes to it as well. And we will see you all next month, hopefully. Have a good one.
Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful day. Bye.